Hello, everybody. We've given you guys what you want. There were some calls after the signing of Ozan Kabak for Dan O'Hagan to come back on and tell us all about him as a player. And so I'm delighted to have Dan on the PinkUn channel to talk to us a little bit about Ozan Kabak and his journey through the Bundesliga. I think everyone's familiar with that little loan spell he had at Liverpool. Talk to us a little bit about how he got on in Germany more generally, and then we'll probably come to sort of what sort of player he is, because he arrived at Stuttgart at a relatively young age from Galatasaray.
He did. He'd played in the Champions League early on for Galatasaray and got the move mid-season to join Stuttgart in what was a relegation season in the end in the 18-19 season. But he made his mark. He looked like a really assured, I'd say a modern centre-back, good with his feet, obviously good in the air at set pieces at both ends of the field. And he made his mark and earned himself a big money move to Schalke. But they, of course, also had their problems. Loaned to Liverpool last season in the middle of Schalke's awful relegation year. So on his CV, he's got those two relegations, Stuttgart and Schalke. But I wouldn't be concerned by that. This is a defender who, when he moved from Stuttgart to Schalke, was on the radar of almost every major club in Europe. AC Milan were linked with him very strongly last season, even before he went to Liverpool. So I think you're seeing in Ozan Kabak a very modern defender, for his age, a very experienced defender at a good level. And yeah, I wouldn't be too concerned by the relegations on his CV because Norwich are getting a player in many ways like Rashida, a player who was on the radar of big clubs, then just for whatever reason just dropped his levels a bit. But clearly there's a player there that has real pedigree and real potential.
Yeah, still only 21. How has he developed from when he first arrived in the Bundesliga to Stuttgart to maybe where he is now, where he's just joined Norwich City? Has that been quite a noticeable development? Has it been up and down, like you say? Has it dipped a little bit recently? How do you kind of see his journey in the Bundesliga?
I think playing in two poor teams, Stuttgart and Schalke, he was a standout player. I've seen in the last 2 years the way he developed physically. He's much more built now. He's a proper unit, I think you'd say. But with his feet, is a very good, assured defender. I think he's got 12 caps for Turkey already as well. He's already become a very important player in the Turkish national side as well. So he's not the finished article yet. Let's not make any bones about that. He's still a work in progress in many regards. But I think Ozan Kabak is a player that could have had his pick of several clubs. So for Norwich to get him, again, is a huge tick for Norwich City and what they're able to attract and what they've done in this, I think, incredible transfer window. And Kabak for me is maybe the most surprising and most standout signing we've seen of all of them.
We'll come back to that statement in just a minute. So we kind of mentioned the two relegations in two relatively poor sides. What was it about Kabak that Schalke looked at the time and thought, yeah, we're going to go for him? Talk to us a little bit about kind of his move from Stuttgart to Schalke, and did he change in terms of the type of player he was? Did he develop a bit more at Schalke? How do you kind of view that sort of move for him at that time?
I think in hindsight, the Schalke move was the wrong move because he went to a team that was on a real downward spiral. Ever since they finished second under Domenico Tedesco, they were just in free fall, and he joined a team almost when that freefall began to become one they couldn't turn around. Obviously relegation when he was out on loan at Liverpool last season, but did begin last season playing for Schalke 04 in the Bundesliga. So I think for him, Schalke was the wrong choice at that time. I'm sure there were other offers, but at Stuttgart, you saw him in just 6 months at Stuttgart, became a leader in what was as I say, a poor and struggling team in that relegation season for them in 18-19. But you could see that even at that age, when he was, 19, 20 years of age, he was a defender who was very assured. He was already a leader in that back line for Stuttgart. And Schalke saw that, thought, yeah, we'll have some of that. They paid 15 million when he played only, as I say, half a season and a handful of games for Galatasaray. So they paid a big fee for a player who was very raw. Only played 40 league games as well for Schalke. So he's not played that many league matches, but I just think in a better team, as you saw at Liverpool last season, he looks a much more assured defender. And he's the player I think Norwich have really been crying out for. We've seen Norman come in as a defensive midfielder. And I think Kabak is, we hope, the final piece in that defensive jigsaw, because you're buying a player there with youth, with a bit of pace, who is, as I say, a leader on the field. And I just think he gives Norwich a lot in that defensive line they don't have at the moment.
Were you surprised when he ended up at Liverpool last January? I think there was they obviously needed centre backs because of the injury crisis that they were going through. Matip and Van Dijk, in particular, Joe Gomez as well had an injury at some stage. Were you surprised when he made that move from a side that was, as you say, struggling against the drop in the Bundesliga to Liverpool, who were trying to contest right at the top of the Premier League?
It was maybe a surprise, yeah, but I think you look at Kabak's pedigree. Take him out of that Schalke situation, which was terminal from almost day one of last season. He was one of their better players, and it's no surprise that Jurgen Klopp saw in him his obviously good attributes. And he came in, I think, played 9 games plus some European games as well for Liverpool last season. And yeah, okay, he was brought in because of the injury crisis they had. I think he may well have stayed at Liverpool had they not got those players back fit. So don't think of him as being a Liverpool reject. He's 21. He's got that enormous potential. I'm sure if Liverpool's squad was maybe not quite as big as it is in that department, they may well have signed him on a permanent basis. So I wouldn't be too put off by the kind of Liverpool reject tag or the double relegation tag. Look beyond that and look at Ozan Kabak, the footballer, in the round. And I think you'll see that Norwich have got themselves it looks like a bargain if they do get him on a permanent basis for the fee that's been mentioned. Because, as I say, a couple of years ago, this guy was on the radar of almost every top club in Europe.
I was gonna pick you up on something you said earlier in terms of Kabak, quite young, quite experienced, which are two things that don't often go hand in hand for a footballer. I mean, look at some of the clubs he's played for already in his relatively short career: Galatasaray, Schalke, Stuttgart, Liverpool. I mean, that's a very good CV. Talk to us about him as a footballer, as a defender. You've described him as a very modern player. Why is it? I think a lot of people will see this and their immediate thought will be, well, why Norwich? Why haven't another club picked him up after that spell at Liverpool? So what do you think maybe the reason is for that? Circumstance, fee? What would you kind of put that down to?
I think maybe there is a case that clubs are frightened off by a player with 2 relegations in the space of 3 years on their CV. At Liverpool, he went in. There was some bad press about his performances. I thought he did okay last season. And yeah, as I say, it's like Rashida. This is a player who 2-3 years ago was almost the kind of guy everyone wanted. He was the kind of, the kind of hipsters footballer. And then because of obviously Schalke's problems, Stuttgart's relegation before that, he kind of dipped below the radar a bit. So obviously wasn't forgotten by Norwich or by Stuart Webber. But I think maybe 1 or 2 other players have come along and overtaken him and thought, here's a guy who's been relegated twice. Is there, something wrong with him? I don't think there is. I think what Norwich have done, they've almost cut through all that noise about, relegations and last season's loan spell with Liverpool maybe not being, given Liverpool's poor form, that successful. But I just think that if you look beyond that at what Ozan Kabak can do, this is a guy who's playing in the Champions League at 18. He's that assured a player. Yeah, if you can handle the pressure at Galatasaray, by the way, you can handle it pretty much anywhere. so don't be afraid by his past CV and the kind of negatives in that. I just think that Kabak as a player is probably in the market right now, for the money they've paid, the best player in that position they could have got.
Yeah, and they had to be patient as they did with Norman. That seems to be a theme this summer. We might come back to Norwich's pursuit of him in a little while. But in terms of him as a defender, I think he played predominantly on the left for Liverpool last season of that back two. But I think, am I right in saying he's played more on the right in the Bundesliga in a defensive pairing? Is that kind of where he's played?
At Stuttgart, yeah, he has played on the left as well. But at Stuttgart, yeah, he was played on the right of the centre backs in that team. But as I say, he's a modern defender. He's a ball player, but he's also one who will do the ugly stuff and do it really well. He can be a bit of a brawler, a street fighter. There was a problem when he was sent off for spitting at Ludwig Augustinsson of Werder Bremen in the Bundesliga a couple of years ago. So he does have that in his locker, that he can be sometimes a little bit maybe rash, but I guess that's part of the age thing. 21 years of age now, not exactly a veteran. Maybe hasn't quite learned to control that element of his game. But what Ozan Kabak is, he will be, as I say, a work in progress. And I think a player, look at his international colleague, Charles Soyuncu at Leicester. This is a guy with a very similar route, playing in Turkey at a young age, into the Bundesliga, did well. Premier League, steps in, no problem at all. So hopefully he'll be as good as Soyuncu's been for Leicester, but maybe that's a lot to ask.
That education at Galatasaray that you mentioned, it's a ferocious place for any footballer at any age in their career. But to do it right as a teenager when you're starting out, I can imagine is particularly ferocious. Do you think that's given him a good grounding and an ability to kind of not be phased by any experience, even though those relegations are on his CV? Are we still seeing a player that's got a pretty decent mentality? It seemed to be the case in kind of the club media that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the spitting thing with Augustinsson a couple of years ago. That's pretty much a one-off, really. He does give off on the field a certain air of calm and composure, which I think for a defender is a wonderful attribute. You think of, the Rio Ferdinands of this world who almost walk through games. I'm not saying he's quite in the Rio Ferdinand mold yet, but he's got that potential. And yeah, he does have an air of calm. There is that rashness in his game, which as the years go by may well drift away. But I think generally, he's a very cool, composed, modern centre-back, good with his feet, good in the air, does the ugly stuff, but also at set plays can get 1 or 2 goals as well. So, as I say, I think you look at the market, we know it's a very inflated market. Norwich don't have huge amounts to spend, so they've had to shop pretty wisely. And for the budget and for what they're getting here with Ozan Kabak, okay, on a loan initially, I do think he's the best they could have got for that amount of money and in the market right now. So, again, on paper, for Stuart Webber, a huge green tick. I think that's a terrific piece of business.
Where do you see him? Obviously, Norwich, you've got Grant Hanley and Ben Gibson. That's the two that they've started with in their Premier League matches so far. Where do you see him slotting into that back four? Who do you kind of see him displacing?
It's harsh to pick out one. I mean, we know they've just paid money for Gibson. Grant Hanley, we know, is an excellent Championship centre-back. Premier League, are the question marks? Possibly. Can Norwich play with the 3 maybe? That's an option as well. So maybe there won't be a player edged out. Maybe they will go with a defensive 3. But I think of the 2 you mentioned, we know Grant Hanley's been a great servant, a wonderful captain. But I just think at the top level, does he have in his locker what Ozan Kabak has? Probably not.
So we've kind of spoke about why Norwich have gone for Kabak. Why do you think Kabak at this stage of his career has gone for Norwich beyond the obvious kind of it's the Premier League sort of tag? What do you think he's seen in Norwich as a club? Because for a lot of players who were maybe playing at Liverpool last season, they wouldn't necessarily look at a newly promoted Premier League side and think that's the club for me. So what do you think he's kind of seen in Norwich to convince him to sign?
I think maybe the same that Rashida has seen and Josh Sargent's seen as well, a club with a German-style ethos, a club that plays good football. I'm sure both Webber and Farke have sold Norwich to Ozan Kabak really well about their philosophy and the way they'll play. He's no mug. He'll know this won't be an easy season. This will be obviously a relegation fight. But yeah, I mean, the law of the Premier League, you may well feel there's unfinished business given his half season at Liverpool last year. He'll want to maybe make a more consistent impression in the Premier League. And, we say which league's the best league, but I think all players want to try themselves in the Premier League. And Kabak will be no different. At 21, he's had 3 years now in the Bundesliga, a year before that in the Turkish Super League. He'll feel the time is right now to have a real crack at the Premier League. And Norwich is a club where he'll play week in, week out. Liverpool, obviously, injuries meant he played a few games, but I think had he stayed, wouldn't have played many games this season. So Norwich is a club he can go to and almost re-find himself again because, as I say, at Stuttgart, he was so highly spoken of and thought about, made a bad call to join a Schalke in disarray. Then Liverpool was only ever going to be a fill-in or a bit part player. At Norwich, he can be not the first name on the team sheet, but certainly a consistent performer week in, week out. That'll be attractive too to a young player who will want to make his mark and get those appearances. Because as I say, for all these games he's played in the German game, there aren't that many in terms of number. So they want to get a few appearances under his belt to show that he can, on a consistent basis, almost rediscover that Stuttgart and Galatasaray form and must put the Schalke spell behind him a bit.
There is a flip side, and I know you've kind of spoken about that Schalke spell not being particularly successful, but there'll be a lot of Norwich fans who are looking at his CV and kind of going down, okay, these clubs are good. Okay, a loan spell at Liverpool. So why have Schalke now decided that and it's been quite public all summer that they would be open to the idea of letting him depart, and various clubs linked. Obviously, Liverpool did have an option, didn't they, to make it permanent? Torino more recently in Serie A have been linked. Newcastle as well, touted with an interest. So from Schalke's perspective, is this a sort of purely financial decision based on their relegation, similarly to kind of, I guess, what we saw with Werder Bremen and their necessity to sell Rashida, Sargent, and they've obviously sold a considerable amount of players as well?
Yeah, I mean, financially, Schalke and Werder Bremen were hit by the pandemic, not just the relegation, but the pandemic more than most. Schalke club were in the Premier League, so the Champions League a couple of years ago, but it's been utter free fall since, and they had to sell. So all their, if you like, top quality, top level players have been moved on. And yeah, the fee they will get if Norwich do turn this into a permanent transfer will help to balance the books at the Feltins Arena, certainly. But yeah, Schalke had to sell. There was never a chance of him playing in the second Bundesliga this season. So I think for all parties, it's a move which really does work.
Absolutely. When you saw, you're obviously someone who is an expert on the Bundesliga. When you saw Ozan Kabak linked with Norwich City and that move beginning to progress, were you surprised? What were kind of your thoughts? Did you think that he'd be a player that was maybe out of the reach of Norwich slightly?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I thought he'd be a player on the radar of maybe Europa League clubs or maybe even one or two in the Champions League. So for Norwich to get him, I think, is an enormous coup. We've seen, obviously, Stuart Webber pull off some, in this window, terrific business. I think you look at Rashida and Sargent, they were players who were never going to be touted with moves to top clubs after last season. Rashida was a couple of years ago, maybe. But I think Kabak, he's the one for me, who I think could have had the pick of many clubs. Many at a higher level than Norwich. So obviously Webber and Farke have sold him the club really, really well. He's obviously bought into what they've told him and the potential Norwich have. And he'll be an ambitious young lad. He'll want to succeed here and maybe use Norwich as a stepping stone, which is part and parcel of the modern game, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was surprised to see Norwich get him, but now he's here. I hope Norwich fans can really enjoy him.
What have you made? Obviously, we had you on to speak about Rashida and Josh Sargent as well. What have you made to kind of their starts to life in England with Norwich City? Obviously, a difficult start for Norwich City generally with Liverpool, Manchester City, and Leicester. Rashida looked particularly bright against Leicester on Saturday. Sargent obviously had a very good cup game, didn't he? Where Norwich beat Bournemouth 6-0 and he bagged a couple of goals. Probably that knock that he got after that game maybe prevented his involvement against Leicester to an extent. What have you kind of made of their starts to life in England? Has it been as you expected so far?
Yeah, I think very good. I think obviously Sargent to get a couple of goals in that Carabao Cup tie will do him the world of good. He'd begun the season in good form too, with goals for Werder Bremen in the second Bundesliga. So yeah, I mean, he's hit the ground running. I think Rashida against Leicester was, I think, by some margin, Norwich's best player. And yeah, I think when he gets his first goal, he'll begin to settle a bit more as well. But I think the early signs are good. I look at the season now as a piece, the 3 games they've played. Always going to be a very difficult start, but I think in each match you can take 1 or 2 positives. Maybe not the Man City game so much, but certainly I thought against Leicester on Saturday the signs were there that Norwich are beginning to find their feet a bit, and now adding Norman and adding Kabak, I think adds that defensive strength as well, which was clearly lacking in the first 3 matches. So I think as a window, you look at all the boxes Norwich had to tick, all the holes they had to fill. I think pretty much they have done. I think they've worked within budget, and I think what they've done is they saw the problems they had, and like any good problem solver, Stuart Webber's gone out there and done what he can to solve them. So right now, I see Norwich as well equipped to survive as they've ever been in the Premier League with this squad right now. Obviously, Daniel Farke has to make all these new pieces in the machine gel and work, but the raw materials, I think, are there for Norwich to survive and have a real good crack at this. And as I say, adding Kabak and Norman this week, I think those are the final 2 pieces which almost complete the jigsaw.
Well, we heard Daniel Farke speak a couple of weeks ago, and he said that those two pieces, obviously, we didn't know who they were going to be at that stage, but he said that would probably be the difference between a good window and an outstanding window. Is that kind of where you are now? This has been for Norwich City the window that they needed in order to equip him. Obviously, we know the line from Stuart Webber last time about sending Daniel to war without a gun, and he said this time he'd probably have a bazooka, a tank, and a few grenades as well. Is that how you kind of see it? And Norwich City's window now. I mean, Norwich have practically brought in a whole new 11 of players this summer.
I think so. And you look at previous promotion sides, from 2004 upwards, never has a Norwich coach been given the backing Farke has been given in this window. The players he's been given by Stuart Webber, I think this time, give them a chance to have a real tilt at this. Now we'll see just how good a coach Daniel Farke is. Now he's in the big league with big players at his disposal. Can he make it work? We know in the Championship, with limited resources, he's been able to craft two brilliant teams who've won promotion as champions, playing some wonderful football. Now in the Premier League, against the best teams in the country, best teams in Europe in many regards, with players who can compete, can he now find a solution and a formula to really mix it with the Premier League teams? I really hope he can.
It's going to be fascinating. Dan, just finally, you're going to be obviously commentating on some international games over the break, potentially some Norwich City players as well. Talk to us a little bit about the games that you're going to be watching and lending your voice to.
I'm doing Milot Rashica's Kosovans twice. So they play against Georgia on Thursday and then Greece on Sunday. So Greece is the game against the two Canaries boys, Zolis and Yanoulis. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But busy time for us commentators, international week. So there's no break for us.
Good stuff, Dan. Thank you very much for your insight. I'm sure everyone will agree that was fascinating to hear all about Ozan Kabak, a player who is so highly rated and I think has created a lot of excitement in amongst Norwich City circles, which is certainly excellent end to the transfer window. Thank you all very much for watching. Thank you to Dan as well for hopping on a few of these across the transfer window. Germany, a very attractive market for Norwich City, and we're seeing that again. Thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you very, very soon.